Hello and welcome to this look at population geography. As we go through population geography, we're going to focus on a few key concepts. We're going to define the term and look at the characteristics and the determining factors of population geography. We're going to look at some visual depictions of different populations by using the demographic transition model and also population pyramids. The infographic on your right shows countries by size. This cartogram indicates which countries have the largest populations. When we accumulate all of the countries' populations to give us a global total, we see that China and India clearly stand out as the front runners in terms of populations. This second graphic comes from the textbook, and we see here again how India and China make up nearly 40% of the world's total population. And you can see where the United States falls, followed by Indonesia, Brazil, and Pakistan. In just a few minutes, we'll have some updated figures for 2020 that show us the changes that occurred since 2015. The images on your screen show congestion, and there are different ways of looking at the total population. One, we could count it. Today we have about 7.8 billion people here on Earth. And we can ask ourselves, are there too many people on Earth? And it really depends how we define that term, or how we define that concept of too many. When we look at arithmetic density, we look at just the number of people divided by the amount of land on Earth. If we look at physiological density, then we look more at how people are using land, how much arable land is available. The way I like to answer this question, are there too many people on Earth, is that if everyone lived like Americans and consumed the way we do, then yes, we would have too many people on Earth. But as we'll see, populations around the world live very different lifestyles, and there's different factors in play. In future lectures, we'll look at agriculture and how we feed the world. So if we're looking at simply sustaining a population, then no, we still have room to go. If everybody on Earth consumed like Americans, then we would be running into an issue with pollution, with food scarcity, with just overall overconsumption. As we look at the U.S. Piece of the puzzle, we see that we're just over 4% of the global population. So while 332 million people is certainly a massive number, in comparison to the rest of the world, we're only a small piece of that puzzle here in the U.S. Again, some updated numbers on China and India show us that combined, these two places reach almost 3 billion people. When we take a look back at population growth, we're going to recognize that population growth, the rapid pace of growth, is a relatively new phenomenon. When we see over the last 200 years this rapid doubling and adding a billion people per 20, 30, 40 years, this is relatively new. At AD, or current era 1, there were 200 million people estimated to be on Earth. By 1000 current era, so just over 1,000 years ago, that doubled to 400 million people, a little bit bigger than the United States population today. That's how many people were on Earth. By 1500, we didn't get too much farther, right? We had 458 million, so only a small increase between 1000 and 1500. That's because when we try to project population growth, we can't always do so with just mathematic formulas and different models, because things happen that we don't anticipate. COVID-19 has had a small impact on population growth, not a major impact, but it allows us to know that pandemics have and will happen. The Black Death that occurred in the 14th century, over 7 years, a virus that entered Western Europe from Central Asia and then spread to different parts of the world, led to a massive population decline. It's estimated that between 30 to 40% of the people around the world died during this plague. Upwards of 80% of certain countries in Europe lost, or up to 80% of the population died in certain countries in Europe. So again, while we project population growth, we do need to recognize that there are bottlenecks or major disruptions in this process that are unforeseen. And in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic is impacting populations. In the 14th century, the pandemic was significantly more severe. So again, we pick up in 1500 with 458 million people. Here's a map showing the expansion and the diffusion of the Black Death plague over Western Europe. Another bottleneck occurred in 1492 when Columbus sailed into the Americas. And this type of bottleneck occurred because new diseases, new viruses were introduced to the Americas. It's believed that there were upwards of 80 million people living in the Americas in the late 1400s, and up to 90% of that population was killed as that population came into contact with foreign viruses and diseases, things like smallpox, the common cold, flus. And the population in the Americas contracted greatly during this time. By 1700, the world's population started to rebound again. We had 682 million people. And then by 1750, the advent of industrialization, we had just under 800 million people. In 1804, it's believed that the Earth reached 1 billion. 123 years later, that number doubled. So less than a century ago, there were 2 billion people on Earth. Keep that in mind. 29 years later, another billion was added. Then 15 years, we added another billion. So between 1927 and 1974, we doubled our population. Again, think back to the population growth that we looked at between AD 1 and 1750. We're starting to see a massive acceleration in population growth here. By 1987, we added another billion, and then 1999, around when many of you were born, we added another billion. We reached 7 billion in 2011, and we're expected to hit 8 billion in just a few more years. Again, it's believed we're at about 7.8 billion today in 2020. And then we're supposed to reach 9 billion by 2042. And then by 2050, we're going to be just about 10 billion. Most of our population estimates today suggest that we will peak around 10 billion. And we're going to look at different factors that affect growth rates and allow us to better understand these population growths and why 10 billion is kind of a magic number for our peak global population. When we look at where population growth is occurring, about 83% of that growth is happening in what are known as developing regions, regions whose economies are shifting from agriculture to industrial, regions that are housed mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So these countries that are going through economic changes are also seeing the most rapid growth in their populations. And we'll revisit this when we look at the demographic transition model to help us better understand some of the social, economic, cultural, and political factors in play. When we talk about population geography, there's a few key terms that we need to discuss. The concept of population geography is basically the study of where and why populations are different, why they change. We analyze distribution, density, and composition. So why is the population of the United States so much different than that of India, of China, of Afghanistan, of Indonesia? So we'll answer some questions. And as we better understand or classify populations, we do so in these categories: fertility, mortality, quality of life, and population change. Fertility is often measured by the crude birth rate, which just looks at the number of births per 1,000 people. Here in the United States, we have a relatively low crude birth rate. We'll understand why that is coming up. In countries that have an economy based on agriculture, we see very high crude birth rates. And we'll see what the connection is between economic activity and the CBR. Our second is the total fertility rate. And this may take um, a bit to comprehend. A lot of times students confuse CBR with TFR. The total fertility rate is the average number of children a woman will have during her childbearing years. In order for the world's population to be stable, meaning not increase or decrease, we need a TFR of 2.1. Now, you might think that 2.0 would be a perfect fertility rate, as two parents have two children and then they double, they replace themselves. But because of some quality of life issues, because of some mortality issues, we're going to see that we need our replacement level to be slightly over 2.0. Mortality is judged by the crude death rate, which looks at the number of deaths per 1,000 people. Now, it's important to note, as we talk about different population characteristics, that a crude death rate is not a quality of life measure. Countries with a high elderly population that we'll find in places like Western Europe and Japan, they're going to have a high CDR as people reach the end of their life. A large segment of that population is reaching older age. So it's important to note, again, that crude death rate is not a quality of life measure. Quality of life is measured in two ways. One, infant mortality, which shows the percentage of children between birth and 12 months that will die. It's a quality of life measure because it tells us about healthcare. It tells us about the status of women. It tells us about education and the availability of help and quality medicine in certain countries. The second is life expectancy. Life expectancy is the average age at death. So a country could have a high crude death rate and also have a life expectancy over 80. Again, a country like Japan that has by percentage the highest number of people 100 or older, they're going to have a higher CDR simply because a large percentage of their population is of an elderly age. They also have a high life expectancy. People are living longer in these places with high qualities of life. Again, life expectancy and infant mortality tell us a lot about healthcare, a lot about the status of women, a lot about the availability to the population, the population as a whole, of medical advancements. And then population change. Generally, the RNI, the rate of natural increase, which is simply CBR minus CDR, fits most countries. Some countries, primarily the United States, also need to throw in net migration, the difference between in-migration and out-migration. So again, in most countries, migration is negligible. In the United States, as we're going to see, net migration is the key reason why the US population is not contracting. Without migration, the US population would shrink. We have a negative RNI, meaning in the United States, we have more deaths than births. When we look at factors that are affecting these measures, we see that we have direct factors like age, your partner, your biological situation. If you are younger, you are more likely to have a child, you are more fertile. As you get older, your risk of not being able to have a child increase. Do you have a partner? We need a match, obviously, to have kids. In the biological situation, are you healthy enough to have children? Indirect really comes into play. Indirect looks at cultural, social, economic, and political factors. Consider the status of women. If a woman is expected to stay home in a traditional setting, they are more likely to have more kids. As women pursue an education and career, we have some indirect factors in play here. People are less likely to have more kids if the mother is going to work, pursuing a career, pursuing an education. Politically, we have pronatalist and antinatalist policies. Are we supporting children through tax subsidies, daycare, parental leave policies, or are we mandating reductions in family sizes. We're going to look at these different factors as we explore the composition